Hello everyone, and welcome to another video by 1960s and 70s Chronicles of a Golden Era. This is going to be the first video in a series of videos giving a brief overview of some of the great bands and artists during the Golden Era, 1960 to 1979. This one, as you can probably tell by my magnificent t-shirt, love this t-shirt, is going to be on Led Zeppelin. Okay, so Led Zeppelin. A band that was created out of the demise of the Yardbirds when the then guitarist in the Yardbirds, when the Yardbirds split, Jimmy Page, decided that he wanted to keep the Yardbirds going, keep the name going, and had the idea of forming a band called the New Yardbirds. Now that didn't take, but he formed a band in any case. And looking around for members, he found a band in Birmingham called the Band of Joy, featuring bluesy vocalist Robert Plant and drummer John Bonham. They were recruited. For a bass player, he looked to highly respected and highly talented session musician John Paul Jones, and he came on board on bass. 1968, the band were together. They were practicing, doing sessions, playing a few gigs, I guess. 1969, they released their first two albums. First album called Led Zeppelin, very bluesy album. The second album, Led Zeppelin II, was more definitive of what was going to become the Led Zeppelin sound, very varied. Not rooted in blues entirely, although there's blues classic on there, the Lemon Song. But there's also what some may consider to be one of the original tracks that created heavy rock, later known as heavy metal. Big riffing rock track, A Whole Lot of Love. A Zeppelin classic, ironically perhaps, shall we say, inspired by a blues song from much earlier, classic traditional blues song. This is well known, but anyway, as a heavy rock song, Whole Lot of Love became and remains, of course, a Zeppelin standard. Led Zeppelin III moved the Zeppelin direction on a bit. It's my favourite Led Zeppelin album, one of my favourite albums of all time, top 10, and features a more folky, acoustic Zeppelin more than any other Zeppelin album. And I love that side of Zeppelin. And that's why it's my favourite album. There is also a blues classic moment for Zeppelin, one of the great Zeppelin tracks, Since I've Been Loving You. The best track in the album, I think most people would agree. And there are some heavy rock sounds on there as well. So you can see that the Led Zeppelin sound is developing. Led Zeppelin could not be pigeonholed as a blues band or a rock band or a folk band or any particular type of band. The music was varied, and that's why they were becoming more and more successful and more influential on the direction of music from the early 70s onwards. Now, 1971 really cemented that. The Beatles had split, of course, 1970. And for me, and I think many would agree, in 1971, Led Zeppelin took over the mantle of the Beatles as the biggest, the greatest, and the most influential band in music at the time. And the album Led Zeppelin IV, otherwise referred to as Four Symbols, sometimes referred to as No Title, for reasons being that it doesn't actually have a formal title. It is represented by four runic symbols representing the four members of the band. This album is considered to be by most people the greatest Zeppelin album, is the album that defines the band and the direction that not only Led Zeppelin would take from then on in progressing and developing musical ideas, but it influenced probably more than any other album from 71 onwards, the direction that rock music would take. It's the album that features the Led Zeppelin classic Stairway to Heaven. This is the track that closes Led Zeppelin gigs. But it also features Rock and Roll, which is just a big, hard-hitting rock and roll song. And that became the track that opens Led Zeppelin gigs. And every track in between is considered a classic. Now, Led Zeppelin at that time really played on the dichotomy that existed between singles bands and albums bands, especially in the UK. In 71, that dichotomy was very clear, especially with the arrival of glam rock and T-Rex, Slade, Bowie, Rod Stewart, Elton John, and a whole lot of other, The Sweet, Mud, Susie Quattro. These were identified mainly as singles bands. Bowie, Elton John, Rod Stewart, for example, they could live in both camps. But bands and artists who adopted the glam rock image and kind of lightweight rock sound became identified as mainly singles chart aiming bands. Now, Zeppelin made a decision right from the start that they would never commercially release a single in the UK. This was a masterstroke because it identified, in the UK, it identified Led Zeppelin as the top and most respected albums band. And it was a great PR move. What Zeppelin also did to kind of emphasize their dedication to the art that we were in, whether this was purely PR or if it was a sincere dedication to making great albums, I don't know. As a Zeppelin fan, I'm going to go for the latter. But instead of releasing a formulaic album every year, the next album we saw from Zeppelin was not 72, it was 73, a 2-year gap. And it was Houses of the Holy. Now, this album, again, sounded very different to the previous 3 Led Zeppelin albums, all of which had sounded different to each other. It was also a dip into what you might consider to be prog rock for Zeppelin, with the album, with this track, No Quarter, very keyboardy track, unusual for Zeppelin, and it became a Zeppelin standard. Also in 73, Zeppelin played the iconic gigs at Madison Square Garden in New York, which were filmed and later used as the core to the movie The Song Remains the Same and a live album, The Song Remains the Same, which these both be released in 1976. But the next new album from Zeppelin, again, we had to wait a 2-year gap. It was Physical Graffiti. It was a double album. But a lot of the tracks, I think most of the tracks, were actually not new tracks. As such, they had been recorded during sessions for previous Zeppelin albums, but hadn't made it onto those albums, but were collected as still great tracks and used on the double album Physical Graffiti, along with some tracks that were new, including the track that became the most unique sounding Zeppelin track of all, and in my opinion, and in fact, the most unique sounding track from the 1970s. I'm talking, of course, about Cashmere. Nothing sounds like Cashmere. Nothing else sounded like Cashmere before. or nothing has sounded like Cashmere since. It has been variously used in movies ever since, and it has been arranged for classical performance, and it works superbly for that. So that was 1975, the album Physical Graffiti, a classic. Most Zeppelin fans, including myself, rate that album very highly. 1976, however, Led Zeppelin released not only one but two albums. I've mentioned the live album, The Song Remains the Same, but also a new studio album, Presence. Now, for me, just my opinion, Presence disappointed me. It seemed to be, for the first time in a Led Zeppelin album, it seemed to be a bit formulaic, a bit this'll do. Other than the track Achilles' Last Stand, that was different. That was a completely fresh sound. The other tracks, a bit too, I've heard this stuff before. Personally, a bit disappointed with Presence. The song remains the same. Took me a long, long time to get into, especially the epic length Dazed and Confused. But I did get into it, and I enjoy that album now. It's 1976 now. Between 75, 76 and 79, the next Zeppelin album release, Led Zeppelin, the band, the members of the band, well, particularly Robert Plant and his family, suffered terrible tragedies of various kinds that I won't go into in this review, but they were heartbreaking tragedies for that no one should have to suffer, and Robert Plant and his family tragically and sadly did. So 1979 was the next time we saw a Led Zeppelin album, and there was a subdued feel to the album and the making of the album. And you hear stories about there wasn't a full enthusiasm across all of the band for making the album. Something had disjointed the Zeppelin dynamic in those years of tragedy. But the album was made. And I like the album a lot. The album is In Through the Outdoor. A greater emphasis on the writing skills of John Paul Jones comes to the fore in this album, and I think for the better, because this is a refreshed Zeppelin. There are new sounds and new ideas happening on that album that take the Zeppelin sound forward in a way that Presence had not. Lyrically, very, very good as well. And for me, that album signaled the next phase of Zeppelin, the next phase of progress for Zeppelin's music. But, as we all know, around that time, Zeppelin suffered, as a band, suffered another tragedy, this time an internal tragedy that affected the band, and it was the untimely and tragic death of drummer John Bonham. Won't go into the details of that either, other than to say it was a tragedy and a great loss to music, not just to Led Zeppelin. The result of that was that the band declined to continue. I think it was the right decision. Led Zeppelin had always been a four-man band, the same four-man band, Plant, Page, Jones and Bonham, and their career should be completed in that way. If the loss of any one of those should mean the loss of the end of the band that had dominated the 70s in the same kind of way that the Beatles had dominated the 60s. And I think it was the right decision not to continue. And Led Zeppelin came to an end as a recording and live band in 1979, effectively. But finished on a high with a great and fresh album with fresh sounds in Through the Outdoor, and a magnificent performance at the Nebworth Festival in Britain. But that was the last that we saw of Led Zeppelin as a new and dynamic force. And like I say, I think the right decision. And the legend and the status of Led Zeppelin continues, of course, to this day as one of the top bands from the golden era of modern culture and modern music. And that's a quick overview of Led Zeppelin. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please leave comments to the effect of telling us all about your own memories of Led Zeppelin, favourite albums, favourite tracks, perhaps albums that, or an album that disappointed. Like myself, you may have seen Led Zeppelin live. I did in 1975 at Earls Court, another one of the iconic gig settings for Led Zeppelin. So Zeppelin memories will be welcomed. And in the meantime, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, like the video, leave comments on the YouTube video and on the Facebook page, and I will see you next time.